Welcome to the Mystery Shack, where the ordinary twists into the eerie and the mundane slips into the unknown. Today, we venture to the small, deceptively quiet town of Gaston, South Carolina. Its peaceful facade conceals something far more sinister. Beneath the surface lies a chilling tale that will creep into your thoughts long after the sun sets. Gather your courage as we uncover the chilling legend of Hanging Man Hill, a tale woven with threads of friendship, fear, and the supernatural. What begins as a simple story soon spirals into a nightmarish reality, making you wonder what truly lingers in the shadows of the familiar. Brace yourself for an unsettling journey. Are you sure you're ready to know what haunts this town? Stay with us, if you dare. Gaston, South Carolina is a desolate little speck of a town, nestled just south of Columbia along Highway 321. It's nothing more than a crumb on the frayed edge of South Carolina's plate. With a population that rarely nudges past 2,000 and an area barely 3.4 square miles, it's the kind of place that feels smaller, quieter, and lonelier than the map suggests. Especially for someone like me, coming from somewhere like Roanoke, Virginia. After Mom lost her job, we had no choice but to move down to where the rest of our family lived. Good old South Kakalaki. I sulked the entire trip. In my mind, the only friends I'd be making in this forsaken place would be fire ants and that unforgiving, blazing sun. Once we settled into our new home at 304 Dixiana Drive, a number I'd never forget, not just because it was etched into the driveway, but also because when you looked at it upside down, it spelled, Ho! I decided to venture out and see if I could find anyone to talk to. I didn't know how to ride a bike back then, and I could barely keep my balance on a skateboard, but I still grabbed my cheap Walmart board and wobbled down the long stretch of road across from our house. Eventually, I reached a small cul-de-sac that seemed to rise slightly uphill. Sitting on the front porch of one of the houses was a chubby kid with glasses, maybe 10 or 11, right around my age. Having no better options, I called out and asked his name. He told me it was Terry. He was an outdoorsy type, something I was most definitely not, but we bonded over our mutual love of video games, and that was enough for me. Over the next few weeks, Terry and I spent most of our time riding around the neighborhood together. But there was one thing he hadn't mentioned right away. He had a serious thing for scary movies. Now, I was a total wimp when it came to anything remotely spooky. If a movie could make you want to change your underwear every 5 minutes, I wanted no part of it. Terry, on the other hand, was obsessed. His room was practically a shrine to horror, with stacks of VHS tapes of all the classic scary movies and a creepy collection of horror movie action figures. Every time I visited, he'd jump at the chance to scare the life out of me with one of his Freddy Krueger dolls or drag me into watching the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in the dark. To make things worse, his room didn't exactly scream comfort. He had a bunk bed, odd, considering he was an only child and only lived with his grandmother, and he always slept on the bottom bunk. The top bunk? Well, that was reserved for his horror movie figurines and slasher flicks. As if I needed more reasons to be creeped out. There were holes in the walls, and everything had this grimy, unsettling feel to it. Watching horror movies in that room made the experience even worse, like the terror was seeping right out of the screen and into the air around us. I never got used to it. After realizing that I pretty much hated every horror movie he threw my way, Terry switched tactics. He started telling me urban legends, stories about our town, but especially about our own neighborhood. Most of them were ridiculous, and I didn't believe a word. That was until he told me about Hanging Man Hill. A year had passed since we first met. By then, I had learned to ride a bike, thanks to Terry's relentless man-up speeches, and we were pedaling through the neighborhood one afternoon. As usual, we stopped in front of the house we nicknamed the Crack Shack, because its residents were constantly zoned out of their minds. Terry's attention drifted to a narrow pathway behind the house, winding up into the woods. He beckoned me to follow without a word. I didn't ask questions. He was always the guide, always leading the way. The path grew steeper the farther we went, with loose sand and rocks threatening to send us tumbling back down if we weren't careful. The trees seemed to tighten their grip around us as we climbed, until finally, we emerged into an open clearing at the top. The first thing I noticed wasn't anything spooky, but the trash. Empty soda bottles, used condoms, that sort of thing. The only structure around was a line of telephone poles stretching endlessly over the dry, sandy hills. If it weren't for the thick trees flanking the sides, it could have gone on forever. The place didn't strike me as significant. I half expected him to drag me to some eerie, overgrown graveyard. Instead, as the late afternoon sky faded to dusk, the scene was strangely serene. I started to relax, assuming this was just another of Terry's attempts to freak me out. But when I looked over at him, his face was different, serious, grim. "Here we are. Hanging Man Hill," he said quietly. "Hanging Man Hill? You're kidding, right? This is just another one of your dumb stories." "Not exactly. This one's real." I rolled my eyes. There was no way I was buying this. He just kept staring at me, his expression unchanging, waiting for me to say something. "How can this be Hanging Man Hill? There's no hanging man, and there's like 50 hills here." Terry didn't flinch. He just pointed toward the base of the hill. "Right down there. Look." Terry pointed toward the nearest telephone pole, its silhouette looming between the two closest hills. A small creek, no more than 5 feet wide, snaked between the hills and disappeared into the endless forest. There was no hanging man, but something about that particular pole felt heavier, darker than the others. "Roy Terrance," Terry whispered, almost reverently. "Who?" He turned to me, eyes gleaming. "It wouldn't be called Hanging Man Hill without a hanging man, right?" Before I could respond, Terry shot off down the hill on his orange bike like a bullet, the tires kicking up loose dirt and leaves. I tried to follow, but my cheap Walmart bike wasn't built for this kind of terrain. The chain rattled and snagged on every twig and root. With one violent tug, a tree root caught hold of the chain, and I was flung over the handlebars, tumbling down the hill. I crashed into the shallow creek with a wet thud, water splashing around me. My knees hit the ground with a dull splush. The water was only a few inches deep, but the impact sent a sharp sting up my legs. I almost yelled for Terry to help, but I saw him standing still at the bottom of the hill, staring up at the telephone pole. His gaze was locked onto something I couldn't see. "Little help," I squeaked, trying to get his attention. He didn't respond right away. His eyes stayed glued to the top of the pole for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he snapped out of it, rushed over, and hauled me to my feet without a word. But his focus quickly returned to whatever had him so mesmerized at the top of that ominous pole. "What is it? What are you even looking for?" I grumbled, irritated. My knee throbbed now that the cold creek water no longer numbed the pain. This whole trip was starting to feel like a giant waste of time, and I wasn't about to leave with just a banged-up leg for my trouble. Terry didn't look at me as he spoke, his voice low and serious. "Roy Terrance. He owned that shed, just beyond the trees." He pointed, and for the first time, I noticed a small, weathered structure tucked behind a large oak. It was barely bigger than a garden shed, but there it was, hidden in the shadows. After his wife and kid left him, he hung himself on the wires right up there, Terry said, nodding toward the pole again. When the cops found him, there wasn't much left, just a charred husk of a man. They say whoever's out here at the exact time of his death gets strung up with him. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. "And when exactly would that be?" I asked, trying to sound skeptical but unable to shake the creeping unease settling in. For a moment, Terry's grim expression cracked. He shrugged, flashing me a goofy grin. "I don't know." Then, just as quickly, he went back to his brooding stare, as if the shadows at the top of the pole held all the answers. "And you're suggesting we stay here and wait for him?" I have plenty of reasons to argue against this, but I'm going to go with, "It's late, and Mom's making dinner, so I'm heading home." Terry shrugged. "Fine. Tell your mom you're sleeping over at my place tomorrow night, and I'll tell my grandma the same. Meet me here at 7. Despite my better judgment, I agreed. What could go wrong? Obviously, Terry was making all this up, but a part of me wanted to be sure. His tone had shifted from his usual playful nonsense to something more serious. Normally, his stories were delivered with a mischievous grin, like he was holding back laughter. This time, though, there was no humor in his voice, and that's what made me uneasy. As we biked home under the fading orange sky, I turned to him and asked, "Why did you get so serious back there? You're always such a clown." He didn't look at me, his eyes fixed ahead. "I lost my grandpa to Roy Terrance. Grandma was there when it happened. Ever wonder why she's so grumpy all the time?" His words hit me like a punch. His grandmother was notoriously cranky, but I'd never thought to ask why. If Terry was playing some elaborate prank, I swore I'd make him regret it. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, and when I finally drifted off, the nightmares came. They were vague, blurry, but I knew Roy Terrance was there, lurking in the shadows. I woke up drenched in sweat, despite the sticky heat of the South Carolina night, my body shivering like I'd been caught in a winter storm. By 6 p.m. the next evening, I was packed and ready. My old-school backpack was stuffed with essentials: a flashlight, a couple of bags of Chex Mix, and my dad's pocket knife. By 6:30, I was pedaling through the neighborhood, faster than any overweight 11-year-old had a right to. To my surprise, I was excited, nervous, sure, but a little thrill of anticipation bubbled under my skin. When I arrived at the creek at 6:55, Terry was already there. A small campfire flickering between us, marshmallows roasting over the flames. He looked up and grinned when he saw me. I had to admit, if I'd bailed, I'd have felt pretty lousy. "How's this gonna work?" I asked, dropping my bike to the ground. "We're just gonna camp out here all night? We don't even know when this is supposed to happen." Empitch. Terry mumbled, his mouth stuffed with a marshmallow. I raised an eyebrow. "What?" He swallowed hard, nearly choking on the gooey mess. I said, "I'll wait here all night if I have to." I rolled my eyes, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, something was out there waiting for us. I dropped down next to the fire, watching as Terry tossed in 3 more lighters to keep it going. The flames flickered lazily, casting shadows that danced in the darkening woods. I pulled out my snacks, trying to focus on something other than the growing sense of unease gnawing at my stomach. After about 3 hours, the first crickets began their relentless chirping, filling the silence left by the fading daylight. The last streak of sun vanished beyond the trees, leaving the sky an inky black. I was getting irritated and tired. Terry, though, was still wide awake, his hand permanently glued to the marshmallow bag, his gaze fixed on the top of the pole like he was waiting for something to happen. "Terry," I grumbled, rubbing my eyes. "Mom, I am tired. If I don't see a crispy dead dude in the next hour, I'm out." "Mfk," he mumbled, barely glancing my way, his cheeks bulging with marshmallow like a chipmunk. I huddled closer to the fire, letting the warmth lull me into a half-sleep. Just as I was slipping into unconsciousness, a sharp, brittle peeling sound echoed through the hills. It was loud, unnatural, like someone ripping apart old, dry wood. My eyes shot open, vision blurred from nearly dozing off. I could barely make out Terry's silhouette, but I could see he wasn't moving. He was staring, wide-eyed, up at the pole. If there had been just a little more moonlight, I might have been able to see what he was staring at. But the crescent moon was hidden beyond the treeline, casting no light on the scene unfolding before us. Suddenly, Terry bolted. He grabbed his bike, marshmallows still clutched in his hand, and took off up the hill like his life depended on it. My heart pounded in my chest as I scrambled to my feet, fumbling for my own bike. I kicked off the ground, pedaling furiously, only to feel my chain pop off with a sickening clunk. Damn it! I cursed, frantic. I had to keep moving. My eyes were adjusting to the darkness, and for a brief moment, I looked back at the top of the pole. That's when I saw him. Roy Terrance wasn't a man. Not anymore. He was a sagging, rotting shape, his skin dark as the night, barely clinging to his bones. His face, if you could call it that, was twisted in a grotesque mixture of agony and ecstasy, like he was stuck in some eternal tortured joy. And that eye, that one gleaming eye, deep in its sunken socket, was locked onto me. The hatred in it was palpable, as if he wanted nothing more than to drag me into the same hell he was trapped in. For a terrifying moment, I thought he was going to climb down from the wire and come for me. His head wobbled on a weak, decayed spine, barely attached to the mass of flesh and bones that used to be a body. But then, with a sickening snap, his neck gave way, and his skull tumbled off, crashing into the fire Terry had started. It was then that his decaying face twisted into a final, satisfied grin. And as the flames consumed what was left of him, his skull disintegrated into ash, disappearing into the night. I didn't realize I was running until I was already halfway up the hill. My feet pounded against the dirt, following the faint bike tracks Terry had left behind. They led further into the hills, away from the path that would have taken us back to the safety of the neighborhood. We weren't out of this yet. Just as I clawed my way to the top of the hill, I saw a thin shape dangling from above. "Oh no!" I croaked. Terry's bike, that blazing orange bike he loved so much, was lying wrecked at the base of a telephone pole. Above, Terry's body hung limply, swaying in the breeze. But it didn't look like Terry anymore. He hadn't been on the wires as long as Roy, but somehow it was worse. His body was partially charred, skin blackened and cracked, but not entirely consumed. His eyes bulged unnaturally from his skull, locked in a permanent expression of horror. Wisps of smoke curled from what was left of his singed hair, still clinging to his head in brittle tufts. The wires above twisted and coiled around his neck like a serpent, tightening with every gust of wind. From his shriveled, scorched hand dangled a half-melted bag of marshmallows, fused to his fingers by the searing heat. The police investigation turned up little. They searched the area thoroughly but found no evidence that anyone had been there. I pleaded with them to check the wires, to believe what I had seen, but they dismissed it all. No footprints, no fingerprints, nothing. Just silence, save for the hum of those cursed telephone lines. For 3 long weeks they kept at it, but eventually the search was called off. Terry was officially listed as missing, though I knew the truth, or at least some twisted version of it. Not long after, Terry's grandmother passed away. She didn't speak much in her final days, just sat quietly, staring at an old photo of her and her husband. She died with that picture in her hands. When the family cleared out the house, they offered me what remained of Terry's belongings. His collection of horror movies, his action figures, everything. Couldn't take it. I told them to donate it all to Goodwill. I didn't want any of it, not the reminders of what happened that night. Years later, I returned. We had gone to visit family in Gaston, and I asked to stop by the old neighborhood. Everything from that night had been erased, either by the police or the passage of time. All that was left were the weathered telephone poles, looming silently over the empty streets like forgotten sentinels. The place was quiet, abandoned, as if nothing had ever happened. Just as I turned to leave, something caught the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement. I stopped, squinting through the fading light. There, caught on a low branch, was a tattered piece of plastic, a bag of marshmallows, melted and disfigured, fluttering softly in the wind.